Oh, hey. So, hi, everybody. I'd like to welcome Erik Brynjolfsson from Stanford to the Inside Talk series. Erik studies labor markets innovation, how innovation impacts society, and he'll be telling us about how the wave of innovation of like AI innovation has affected labor markets so far, productivity, and society in general. Yeah, welcome, Erik.
Thanks, Greg. It's a real pleasure to be here, and looking forward to having a chance to share some of the research, but also very much hearing your questions and comments and suggestions. So I hope we can make this interactive. I've set aside a little time towards the end where we can have a general discussion about just about anything, but also feel free during the talk to raise your hand or jump in, or whatever the norm is about any of the topics that I'm discussing at that particular time. Actually, for me, it's more fun if it's interactive, so I encourage you to do that. So what I'm going to be talking about is how AI is changing society and the economy in particular. I see this as the biggest technological change of our era, of our generation, and I'll first connect it to some historical changes. And I'll particularly look at two aspects of it: what it's doing for productivity and growth, and thereby living standards on average. But secondly, how it's changing the nature of work, the kinds of jobs that are being more affected and less affected. And one of the things we're seeing is some big changes in income inequality that are in part due to changes in technology. There are other forces at work as well, and maybe some insights into how that we expect that to play out in the coming years and what we can do to shape it in the direction we might want to go more. So let me start here by sharing the first slide there. As Greg mentioned, I'm at Stanford. I came over from MIT this year. I used to be there for about over 20 years with, I think you heard from some of my colleagues recently, David Otter and Doron Asimoglu. We've been working with them. And over at Stanford, we've started something called the Stanford Digital Economy Lab, where we're diving more closely into this with a lot of industry partners and, of course, the good folks at the Stanford Department of Economics, Business School, and the AI Lab there. In particular, I'm part of the Human-Centered AI Initiative. Let me start by just stepping way back and taking a big perspective on how things have changed, because sometimes we forget how dramatically things have changed for humans over the past several thousand years. For most of human history, almost everybody on the planet lived at a subsistence level, just barely having enough food to eat and not a lot of technological comforts. In the late 1700s, that changed dramatically, and suddenly every measure of well-being started improving on lots of different ways. One of the most obvious ways is to measure it by GDP per capita, how much you get, how many televisions and meals and jets you can afford. And that change in the late 1700s coincided with the introduction of the Watt steam engine. That was a much better way of harnessing power, and it was orders of magnitude better than what people had been doing previously, and it ignited the Industrial Revolution. It started having us replace muscle work from us and animals with machines, and we were able to just do much, much more. So productivity and living standards started growing at about 2% per year at that point. And you compound that, and you do really quite well up until recently. We've had tremendous improvements in overall global GDP per capita. It's about 10 times higher than that in the United States, one of the leading countries. Now, the Watt steam engine was an example, really the first really big example of what economists call a general purpose technology, or GPT, not to be confused with the language models. General purpose technologies are important because they have a set of characteristics that Tim Bresnahan and Manuel Trachtenberg described. First off, they're pervasive. They can be used in many parts of the economy. They're improved over time, so it's not just a one-time hit. And most importantly, this third element, that they spawn complementary innovations. They allow you to invent things on top of them and thereby multiply the economic impact. And as it says at the top of this slide here, not only is the steam engine a GPT, electricity, general purpose computing, but in particular, I'd make the argument that artificial intelligence is maybe the most important GPT of our era. It's certainly affected many different parts of the economy or has potential to do that, improving dramatically over time. And there's a whole set of complementary innovations. In fact, one might even say that it's the most general of all general purpose technologies. And here's your colleague and my friend, Demis Hassabis. And you go to over to DeepMind in London, and they have this little slogan there on the wall. Our goal is to solve intelligence and then to use that to solve all the other problems in the world. So I appreciate the modest ambitions that Demis and you all have. But by that standard, it certainly is a very general purpose technology. Now, we've crossed an important threshold in terms of what these technologies can do, and we're beginning to be able to see that they can solve many problems as well as humans or better than humans. Here's the ImageNet data set that I think most of you are familiar with. My colleague, my Stanford colleague, Fei Li, took the lead in pulling that together. And image recognition has gotten dramatically better since Jeff Hinton and his colleagues introduced deep learning techniques around 2012 or in 2012. And since then, everybody's been using those same techniques. And within a few years, it got up to 95 or 98% accuracy in classifying images, something that machines were pretty bad at before. And just for fun here, I put in some data on humans. We're not perfect. Sometimes I don't know the difference between an antelope and gazelle or the many different breeds of dog that are on ImageNet. And machines are getting to the point where they do that as well or better. I should caution, as I think you know, that doesn't mean that all image or vision problems can be done better by machines. Self-driving cars are still struggling to recognize some things, and we still have room for improvement in lots of them. But if you think about that threshold there, it's important because in many tasks, a machine can now do it as well or better than a human. And if you're an entrepreneur or a manager and you have to choose between two different ways of doing a task, and now you have a technology that does it better than people, you're going to switch over to the one that does it better, not to mention cheaper and faster and more scalable. And of course, it applies to many, many classes of problems, not just looking at faces on Facebook or whatever. You can use it to help diagnose diseases from medical images. You can generate speech, transcripts using speech recognition, or help in pharmaceutical R&D or fraud detection, traffic flow. There are so many other applications. Anytime you're really mapping from a set of inputs X to a set of outputs Y, there's a potential for deep learning to do as well or better than humans in those tasks. So it's kind of a gold rush, as you all know, where more and more parts of the economy, more and more tasks are being affected by these techniques. So let me not spend too much more time on the technology. You guys can probably teach me about that, and maybe you will. But I want to now apply that to how it's changing the economy. And as I mentioned, first we'll talk about productivity, and then we'll talk about the transformation of work. And when we talk about productivity, an important fact to bear in mind is what I would call the modern productivity paradox. And the issue there is that although I can show you many, many slides of data of improvements in machine learning and just staggering better technology, when you look at the productivity numbers, which is sort of the best single metric we have so far, I'm working on some other ones, of how well the economy is using those technologies to improve living standards, productivity has been remarkably disappointing. In fact, rather than speeding up, as you might expect, productivity growth has slowed down. So in the 90s and early 2000s, productivity in the United States grew by about 2.8% per year, which is a pretty good pace, faster than it had historically. But since 2005, it's grown at less than half as fast, about 1.3% per year. I'm going to take the year 2000 out. It kind of went down and bounced around a lot. Last quarter, we just got some data that actually last quarter would look pretty good. But if you look at the trend over years, it bounces around a fair amount, but it's generally been quite disappointing, slower than most people predicted, slower than I predicted. And that's the core of the paradox, is how can we have better and better technology, yet slower productivity growth? And it's not just in the United States. just about every advanced wealthy country had a similar level of slowdown. And Chad Severson at the University of Chicago and Daniel Rock at Wharton and I had a paper out called AI and the Modern Productivity Paradox, where we document this in much more detail. And in particular, we lay out 4 possible explanations for this paradox. And I'm going to flesh these out a little bit for you. The first one is, I think we have to put on the table, maybe this is it's just false hopes. And I have a friend, Bob Gordon, who's been a techno-skeptic for 20 years or so. And whenever I talk to him, he's like, well, these guys, in Silicon Valley, they're just hyping a lot of stuff. The technology really isn't that important. It doesn't compare to the to indoor plumbing and the flush toilet and other big inventions of the past. And so he's not someone who thinks that the internet or AI is really going to move the dial much. So I think that's one of the possibilities. I don't really buy it, but I want to put it on the table. A second one that I think has a lot more evidence behind it is mismeasurement. And the issue is that we just have in some places, very bad measures of the economy. And it may be that the productivity and the economic growth is much higher than what the official statistics say. And in particular, I'm going to zoom in on this in a little while. There's a problem with measuring the digital economy. Digital goods that have zero price don't get measured very well at all in the economy. We consume, whether it's Wikipedia or YouTube or other goods and services without having to pay for them. And that may make us better off, but it doesn't move the dial on the officially measured productivity. So there's a growing gap there potentially between our well-being and what the government data say. A third explanation is the way the technology is being used, that in many cases, the technology is being used to concentrate wealth and power to a smaller and smaller group. The top 1% or the top 0.01% has gained the lion's share of these benefits, and people in the middle of the income distribution, the median worker at the 50th percentile, has gotten very little of that. And relatedly, there's a lot of zero-sum dissipative efforts, zero-sum advertising or zero-sum rent-seeking on Wall Street or elsewhere, where these technologies essentially result in an arms race that make each side better. But if they're mainly using that technology to grab benefits from other parties, the net effect could be zero or even negative. And so there may be some of that going on as well. And then last but not least, in fact, I'm going to argue this is probably the most important one, is that there's just inevitably some very big implementation and restructuring lags. Even for very important, powerful technologies like the steam engine and electricity, it can take a long time for the benefits to emerge. And so what you often see is a breakthrough technology, a new general purpose technology that people are awed by, but it doesn't benefit the average person until people figure out a way to reinvent production processes and change the way work is done. And that might take years or even decades. And during that time period, it's not like nothing's happening. People are working very hard to invest in what we call organizational capital and human capital. And they're creating those assets. But again, as I mentioned in point 2 above, many of those assets are not measured in our economic statistics. So if you build a factory, that counts as a new asset. But if you invest in new business processes that may increase output just as much, that generally is not counted as an increase in our assets on the national, or for that matter, corporate balance sheet. So you get a bit of mismeasurement in there of value being created that is in the form of intangible assets, and it doesn't turn into things we can consume for 5 or 10 or more years. And those lags can account for what we're seeing in the data as well. Let me just focus mostly in the interest of time, and I want to get to the discussion part as well. I'm going to focus on item 2 and 4 mostly, although feel free to ask me about any of the 4. We can talk about them more. But let me now zoom in a little bit more on number 2 and explain exactly what's going on there. So this is the idea that the reality is significantly better than what we're measuring in the data, and relatedly that the gap is getting bigger and bigger. Now, we all know that there's been an absolute explosion of free digital goods. Google has been responsible for a big share of those, but many others as well. And these free digital goods, people are spending several hours a day consuming them. And so if you can sort of count how they vote with their eyeballs, they're saying they're valuable, more valuable than the next best alternative they can use in their time. But the official data don't show much value being created. There is a category in the GDP called information goods that includes all these software and internet goods. It also includes books and music and television, magazines. Back in 1983, that was 4.7% of the total GDP of the economy. And after this big explosion of digital goods, you can see it kind of bounces around, but I need to update this chart, but by 2015, it was still only about 4.7% of the economy. And so it's almost like the whole digital revolution didn't happen when you look at the GDP metrics. How can that be? Well, it's because GDP measures everything that's bought and sold in the economy. And if something has zero price, to a first approximation, it has zero weight in the GDP statistics. And so it's like it doesn't exist. Does that mean that it's not valuable? No, it's not saying it's not valuable. It's just saying it's not part of our official GDP measures. It could be very valuable. And that's where this gap is emerging. Simon, go ahead. Is there a question?
Yeah, can I ask you about, this sounds like a normal enough problem in financial markets where you have a public corporation has a decent way of valuing the value, whereas a private corporation, because it's not on any public market, they have no good value. So are those transferable metric, like approaches to like these hidden assets?
Well, that can sometimes help. And later, actually, I'm going to use some of the data from public markets to triangulate a little bit, but not necessarily. I mean, I have up there Khan Academy, Wikipedia. Those create huge amounts of value, but there's no, public corporation or profit or stockholder or other measure that's capturing the benefit either. So any of those financial metrics is going to miss it. And if the economy becomes more digital and has more of those kinds of goods, we're not going to capture it. There may be others like YouTube and Google search where there's a significant revenue captured through advertising. Congratulations on a record quarter there. So that is a little more complicated. It actually, the way that GDP accounts it, advertising does not directly count in GDP. It's an intermediate good. So it doesn't add up to GDP either. However, it may indirectly show up in terms of affecting all your wages and paying your salaries, and then kind of through a multiplier effect affect other parts of the economy. So it's a little subtler, but the short answer is that for any of the free goods, it's basically entirely missed. For the goods that are supported by advertising, there's a number, but that number is largely disconnected from the value being created. They're two separate numbers, and you can have a lot of value creation without much advertising revenue, or vice versa. So it's not a good metric of the contribution. So we have a real problem there in terms of measuring value of those goods. Go ahead.
So, how do people, do they quantify the value of education? That seems closer to digital goods.
That's another one that's almost entirely missed. So I don't want to scare you guys, but the GDP numbers are missing huge chunks of the economy. And this is not something like I discovered or anything. Simon Kuznets, the guy who developed GDP back in the 1930s, one of the great inventions of the 20th century, Paul Samuelson said, and I agree, it was one of the great inventions. Simon himself said that, look, this is not a measure of well-being or welfare or of how well off we are as a country. You should not use my GDP number for that purpose. So every once in a while people quote that, but mostly people just ignore his advice. And every time I open a newspaper after the new quarterly numbers come out, everyone has a phrase like the economy grew by so and so amount, or living standards up by so and so amount. And it's not that. I think it's one of those cases of it's the only game in town. So we have a number, and people want to use it much more broadly than it was ever intended to be used. And that's one of the things we're going to try and fix, is that GDP was not designed, was not intended, and does not capture living standards. But since it's the only number we have, the Federal Reserve, Congress, the president, and just about every journalist uses it as if it's a measure of our living standards. I sometimes slip into that. I try not to, but that's the core of the problem. I mean, to be a little fair to GDP, even though it misses big parts of our benefits, it is on average correlated. Like, cars are in GDP, and if you have twice as many cars, arguably you have twice as much utility from cars, twice as many apples, twice as many haircuts. Any of those things will add to GDP and also add to our well-being. So there are big parts, the ordinary part of the economy, where GDP and well-being are, pretty closely related to each other. But the problem I see emerging is that the part of the economy that's based on atoms is shrinking relative to the part of the economy that's based on bits. And GDP works tolerably well for the part that's based on atoms, but really badly or completely misses the boat on the part that's based on bits. In fact, let me just make it even worse. Not only does it miss the value, but in many cases, when you switch a good from atoms to bits, the sign is the opposite. Like I got Wikipedia in the top left corner there. People used to buy and read Encyclopedia Britannica. I guess they're out of business now, but there used to be a lot of value created by Britannica. Wikipedia is 100 times bigger. Surveys suggest it's roughly equivalently accurate, has much more coverage, much more timely. I don't think there's any doubt that Wikipedia creates a lot more value than Britannica. But in the GDP statistics, Wikipedia is a smaller contribution than Britannica ever was. And so the GDP numbers went down when we substituted, even though the consumer welfare went up. So there's a case where not only are you missing it, you got the sign wrong. And that's true for a lot of the goods up here. One more important point to bear in mind, I've been jumping between GDP and productivity. You should know that productivity, as it's used in the official statistics, is simply defined as GDP divided by hours worked. So you don't have to be a math whiz to know that if you mismeasure GDP, the numerator, you're going to mismeasure productivity by the same amount. So if we're missing trillions of dollars of GDP, we're also missing trillions of dollars of productivity growth. And so that's really the nub of the problem there. Now,
thank you.
We're trying to work on a better metric, and we call that GDP-B, where the B stands for benefits. And the idea of GDP-B is not to measure what we're paying for goods or the cost of the goods, but to measure how much value we get from them. And that's, as you can see, as soon as I say that, that's really closer to what we're trying to understand when we're looking at living standards. And the way we're doing that is through large numbers of massive online choice experiments. And what that means is we ask people how much we would have to pay them to stop using a particular good. And the idea is that you maybe get a lot of value for something even if you don't have to pay for it. So we offer to pay people if they'll stop using Wikipedia or Facebook, or even jet travel, breakfast cereal. You can do it for whether goods are made of atoms or bits. You can do this. And different people have different values. Many people, you have to pay them $100 a month to stop using Facebook. Other people, you could pay them $10 a month or even $0 and they'll stop using Facebook. And so you get a demand curve with some people having higher values, some people having lower values. And the area under that demand curve gives you an estimate of the total value created for consumers by that particular good. And
is that different from if you took it away from me, how much would I have to pay you to get it back?
It is a little different. So I wish that willingness to pay and willingness to accept were the same number. And in naive economics, they are the same number. In practice, there's some cognitive biases and others that people have looked at, anchoring effects, that the numbers are a little bit different. So you have to take that into account and consider how different they are. But that's sort of that's a second order kind of effect. You could kind of measure it with willingness to pay or willingness to accept, and you get slightly different numbers. But conceptually, the idea is, what's this good worth to you? And it's a little worse than what I said in that for some goods, the gap between willingness to pay and willingness to accept is greater than it is for other goods. So I guess a point to be made there is this GDP measure that we're doing. It gets at, I think, conceptually what we're trying to understand, the value of goods better than traditional GDP. But it also has some big weaknesses. It tends to be noisier. Traditional GDP, you can measure with pretty good precision to like 9 significant digits. And that's exactly what somebody paid for something. So we know that at the cash register, and it gets summed up, and the Bureau of Economic Analysis has those data. For our GDP measure, with these large surveys and these conceptual issues, it's a much noisier metric. So we're not going to get 9 significant digits of precision. But what I like to say is sometimes it's more important to be approximately correct than to be precisely wrong. And so it's a measure that's closer to what I think we care about, even if it's not as precise. And this little chart I have here on the left of my slide illustrates that. It doesn't have the precision, so it's a little bit to the left of GDP down in the bottom right, but it's closer to relevance to well-being. It's further up on the chart. And so there's a little bit of a trade-off. And there's ones that are even further up and to the left there, like well-being metrics. There are a number of people who do very simple surveys where they ask about how happy are you with life on a scale of 1 to 10. And they've been doing these for years in different countries. And, that may be the ultimate measure, just overall happiness, never mind, what you're spending on different things. That's an important number, but it's even less precise than GDP. It's just a number from 1 to 10. And people have a hard time, telling interviewers whether they're, a 7 or an 8 on that happiness scale or whatever. It is loosely correlated with GDP and other measures, with health and so forth. People in wealthy countries with longer life expectancies tend to rate their lives as happier than people in worse situations, but it's pretty noisy. So our GDP measure is meant to sort of fill a pretty big gap there between the happiness metrics and traditional GDP and productivity. A little more precise, or a lot more precise than the happiness metrics. We do it for every single good in principle. But it doesn't have the same level of precision as traditional GDP. So that's the trade-off. Does that sort of address your question there? Or is there anything else you want to ask about that?
No, super interesting. Thank you. I'm thinking about what it means for like surgical anesthesia. Like you don't have to pay me much to not use it in a month unless I need it. In which case, if you take it away from me, there's no amount of money large enough for me to want it back.
Absolutely, exactly. So yeah, those are some. we should. That's a good one. We should add that to our next survey. Is anesthesia. Although actually, there are people like for childbirth that really don't want to have it. I don't know. I don't understand them, but some people have different preferences. And one of the nice things about our approach, by the way, is we don't get just one number for each good. We get a whole demand curve. So this heterogeneity is sometimes just as interesting, that you get people with very different values for the same good. In fact, one of the things we need to do going forward with Facebook is include some negative numbers. I know that there are people who will pay to not have access. They use a tool like Rescue Time to block themselves from that, or maybe for cigarettes or other goods where people would prefer not to even have access to them, or at least some people. And there's some papers there that you can read in more detail.
So, Amy,
right.
Yeah, actually, Eric, thank you so much for this. It's super interesting, and I recognize you have more to share, so I'll try to be fast. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about, how to sort of factor for Western encoding, like Western values encoding in, well-being metrics, for example. Like you mentioned, happiness not necessarily being rated as high in areas that are less economically well off. Right. I'm curious how much of that has to factor for the encoding of how the questions are asked, sort of speaking more to the subjective nature of things.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I think is a strength of GDPB is that it converts everything to dollar terms. So, interpret that for how you will, but it's how much people would give up a dollar in exchange for this particular good or service. So it's a bit of a common metric. One of the concerns with the well-being metrics is that just translating the word happiness, there's dozens of different synonyms for happiness in English and in Danish and in Hindi and other languages. And so you have to be very careful about how you translate it. And some of the concerns are that people, interpret them in different ways. With the dollars, it's what this dollar is, and at least you know what you're measuring. You may, some people may value money more than other people, and that would be the trade-off. But it creates a little bit more of a common metric, just like GDP does. So everything's converted into dollar terms. Needless to say, or maybe it's important to say, different countries have very different levels of dollar income, and so they're going to be able to pay different amounts. And in some countries, just because they don't have as much money, they're not going to be able to put as high value on different things, or they'll paying them a small amount, they'll can see that as a big change in their lives. So you have to calibrate that, but in a way, that's part of what we're measuring is how much dollar value they get from the different items.
Thank you.
So let me talk about the second big explanation, and I'm just looking at time, and that's implementation and restructuring lags that I also think are really important. And let me flesh out the story of electrification a little bit, because I learned a lot from reading about this. My Stanford colleague, Paul David, described this in great detail. In the 1880s, American factories started introducing electric motors to replace steam engines. But according to the industrial records, productivity did not increase in the 1880s or 90s or 20s. It didn't really increase significantly until about 1920, 30 or 40 years later. I mean, that's just astonishing that there was this huge lag between the introduction of electric motors and productivity improvements. Paul David studied what was going on, and the old factories were built around a big central steam engine. The way the thermodynamics work, you want to have a big engine in the middle, and then they powered machinery through pulleys and crankshafts that went all around it. You couldn't have a crankshaft too long, or the torsion would break it. So the equipment was all kind of clustered around the central power source, often in 3 dimensions to minimize the radius. When they introduced electricity, what they did was they took out the steam engine and they got the biggest electric motor they could find, put it in the middle there, and hooked everything up again. Now, did that lead to a big improvement in productivity? Not really. Not much really changed. And even when they're building new factories, they built them with that same model because that was just how they thought factories worked. There was a debate in the literature about what was called unit drive versus group drive. And eventually, unit drive won over. And the idea was, instead of having everything powered by a group of machinery all powered by the same power source, each piece of equipment would have its own separate electric motor. And that allowed them to separate things out. And in the 1920s, you started seeing the widespread adoption of a new model where the factories were laid out on a single story, and more like this one. And each piece of equipment had its own separate electric motor. And this, for the first time, they started having the equipment laid out not based on who needed to be near the power source, but rather what's the flow of materials. And that was a big improvement in productivity, like 100%, 200%, tripling of productivity growth in those factories. The takeaway is that electricity by itself didn't lead to big productivity gains. It was a combination of electricity and the electric motors, plus a new way of organizing work. And it may seem obvious to us now, looking back in history, but at the time, it was not at all obvious that this was going to be a better way of organizing. And it took basically 30 years, long enough for a generation of managers to retire or die, for a new generation to introduce these new methods of work. There are a lot of other co-inventions that happened along this time, some of them much smaller, some of them medium, some big. But all these co-inventions that were enabled by electricity ultimately are what drove the big productivity gains. Now, that lesson is something that has recurred over and over. It occurred when the steam engine was introduced. It occurred when computers were introduced, and electric and microcomputers and PCs. It occurred in many other technologies, and it's happening now with AI and other technologies. With IT, about 90% of the investment when you introduce a new, say, enterprise resource planning system is in business process redesign and reskilling. Only about 10% is on the software and the hardware. So it's not at all unusual for these intangibles to be much bigger and much more important than the hard computer and technology investments. You can try to estimate how important these intangibles are through this kind of a market value equation here. What this shows is on the left side is the market value of the company. Can you guys see my cursor when I do this? I'm not sure. Is that visible?
No.
Doesn't look like it.
Okay. All right. So I'm pointing to the market value on the left side here. And that is the cost and the value of all the marketable assets like stocks and bonds. And that's going to be a function of the capital assets, K, as well as some controls and a constant term. But this lambda factor is how much intangibles are associated with each different kind of capital asset. If lambda were equal to 0, what that would mean is that when you buy $1 of computers, your market value goes up by $1. You have one more dollar of assets. If lambda is greater than 0, what it means is that in addition to the computers, there's also some intangibles that are created or necessary on average for the success. And what we're going to show is that for traditional goods and services, property, plant, and equipment, lambda is about 0.7. So this coefficient is about 1.7 altogether, 1 plus lambda. And so there's a little bit of intangibles associated with most types of equipment. Not much intangible associated with other assets like cash and marketable securities. But there's a huge amount of intangibles associated with IT. The coefficient is like 15, which means in our simplest regression, for every dollar of IT capital, there's another $14 of intangibles. And you can measure it lots of other ways. And it typically ranges in the neighborhood of about $10, anywhere from like $7 to $17 there. And the interpretation is that companies that have IT assets have the market value goes up by a lot more than just the IT hardware and software. They also have a lot of intangibles. And so there's direct evidence now that the market sees these companies as having some very important intangible assets that separate them from their competitors.
Is this something that,
go ahead.
Is this something that you can really kind of treat on a linear level? So like I think about Rebecca Henderson's like supply side disruption, right? Like Kodak was never going to win mobile phones and the mobile just because they didn't have the workforce. That's not how they were set up to succeed. So I guess I'm a little bit curious because if your argument, I'm thinking about the big steam engine turning into the big motor, turning into smaller motors, right?
Right.
If your argument is a little bit around, or at least maybe my intuition around your argument is you need to totally, change the layout of value, so to speak.
Yep.
Is this a continuous curve or is this almost like a kind of a step ladder thing, right? Something big changes somewhere.
Well, so this is really being identified off the difference between the different firms. So the firms that are successful versus the firms that are less successful. And so you're going to have, hundreds or thousands of firms in the economy in this regression. Somewhere in there, I have about 1,300 observations in most of these, more when we also have time series. And you're basically comparing the different firms to each other. So it's sort of it's the average effect you're getting across all those different firms. There are some firms that invest a lot in IT and fail miserably, and there's others that invest and do really well. This is the overall average of those. It combines some Kodaks with some Intels and some Nokias and some Apples, and that's the overall average.
Is there a phenomenon though in which like a certain firm will say our marginal dollar towards fixing this is not going to work because of the way our firm is laid out, right? Is Kodak going to say, listen, we absolutely see that the next $1 trillion in cameras is going to be on digital, and we're just not going to succeed there because we're not.
Exactly. That's part of what helps identify this. So not so much in this particular paper, but I have another number of other papers where we look at the complementarities, and what you see is what you're describing, that firms that have some of the necessary conditions in place are more likely to invest in the other components of a complementary system that may have many parts, not just IT and organizational capital, but other characteristics. There's two tests of these complementaries. One is that they tend to invest in them together, and if they don't have the wherewithal, then they don't invest in any of those components. So smart managers will tend to see this to some extent and either do some or both. But the managers are far from perfect. And so you also observe that there are lots of mistakes being made. And that allows you to also see that when they do successfully invest in the complements and put them together, they get higher performance than when they mistakenly invest in some when they don't have the other components in place. So yeah, so you get a little bit of each depending on how smart the managers are.
And one last thing, and sorry if I hope I'm not boring anyone with my questions here. So I'm actually not, I'm a little fond of your arguments 1 and 3, and I know you're focusing on 2 and 4, but there is a case to be made for, I think, argument 3 that like the marginal dollar that Google spends on, call it AI, is going to be much more productive than the marginal dollar spent by any other firms, because uniquely as a technology, the benefits of AI go to the largest firms that have the data, right? And also have maybe the surfaces and all that. I guess, how does that interact with this? Because, you know,
well, so Google, that would be a little bit of 4 and a little bit of 3. So some of it will show up in this, that they will pull ahead. And I'm going to show you in the next couple slides here that exactly what you just said. We see some firms pulling ahead, but it also may be, some of it might be zero sum. So that would be more like argument 3. I'm mostly going to focus on the idea that there's, you know, a bit of a winner take all. I'll show you that in a minute. But I think you're right. All 4 of those explanations have some. I put some weight on all 4 of them. I see this number 4 as being probably the most important overall one. So in fact, let me show you some of the data on this. It's here's what we see in the overall growth of intangibles in the economy according to just this coefficient. You can see it really spiked up in the year 2000, and it's going up again recently. You can separate that into price and quantity with a little bit of algebra. I'm going to skip it, it's in the paper. But conceptually, that chart on the left is what I showed you a minute ago. The middle one is what's happening to the price of digital capital. And there was a real spike in what people were willing to pay for these intangible assets around the year 2000, aka the dot-com bubble. But since then, it's been relatively flat, which is kind of interesting. And then the quantity of digital capital has actually gone up quite a bit. It went up a lot in the 90s. It fell a bit in the Great Recession, and now it's at an all-time high. So that's the overall quantity of computer-related digital capital or intangible assets that's associated with these investments. But we can now, and this is how they compare to other kinds of intangibles, but we can now separate them into different types of firms. And this gets to the question that was just asked. You see that the top 10% of firms are getting the lion's share. The vast majority of the intangibles are going to them, and the gap is growing. You see the bottom 80%, there's been hardly any investment since the year 2000 in intangible assets. Some in the 80th percentile, but most of it's at the very top percentile. This particular chart, by the way, does not include Google. This is only for firms who are around all the way back into the 90s. So before Google was founded. If we have another chart in the paper where we include Google and Facebook and some of the other more recent firms, and the gap, as you can imagine, is even greater. So this is in a way understating how much the superstars are pulling away from the rest. To me, it's very striking how these IT-related intangible capital or digital capital is something that not all firms are benefiting from or investing in. It's quite skewed, and as you were just saying, it appears that some firms are better at investing in them, or have more of a commitment, or maybe able to better monetize them than other firms, or maybe just understand them better. But for whatever reason, it's not evenly distributed in the economy, and rather than being something that's becoming more widespread, it's something that's becoming more concentrated.
So one more question about the prior data. So a lot of the stuff is pointing to, like, you had a linear model that just like chopped up into different kinds of goods. And now you're pointing to that, like, this real model is nonlinear and incorporates all these structural effects of companies. So how would you create this fully nonlinear model? What data would you need to flesh it out?
Yeah, so I think there is a data constraint just in terms of having enough observations. So in these data, we needed publicly traded companies. So that limits us to sort of the universe of CompuStat companies, a few thousand companies. And the other constraint is getting high quality IT data. And that's gotten harder, not easier, over time. it used to be you could go to the chief information officer and they would know about all the computers in the company. That's not true anymore. And worse than that, most of the computing power, thanks to folks at Google Cloud and Amazon and elsewhere, isn't even on the company anymore. People are using computing power outside the company. And so one thing maybe you guys can help us with is if we could have better data on the compute and the storage used by companies, not just on premises, but through cloud services and other ways, we would be able to get a better measure of these metrics going forward. We would combine, the IT data with the performance data, the stock market data, and then other work we've done with the census. We've been asking explicit questions about the kinds of organizational changes they're making. So the census allowed us to add some questions to a series of surveys that go to all businesses. Google and other companies have undoubtedly answered them, where we ask about some of the management practices and organizational changes that are going on in the companies. And that's also been something we've added to the mix. Let me plow ahead a little bit because it looks like we only have about 12 minutes left. Is that right?
Wait. Yeah, but I mean, if folks can stay on a few minutes longer, if you
yeah, okay,
that's fine.
I will. Let me. I want to get to the future of work part. So actually, this is important here. So because of these intangibles are important, the traditional productivity measures that Bob Stoller got a Nobel Prize for, et cetera, only look at capital and labor inputs. But if you consider the intangibles, remember Lambda, the formula for productivity growth and economic growth gets more complicated. And in particular, it leads to this J-curve effect. If you look at, say, the blue line here, that's the total mismeasurement of productivity. It looks a little bit like a J to me. It goes down and then it comes up. And the idea here is that initially companies are investing in intangibles, but those intangibles take real resources, cost, labor time, other kinds of costs. So you have more input being used up, but they don't immediately generate output that the consumers or anybody can benefit from. So productivity appears to go down. Companies are doing this work without getting anything out. Google's spending billions on self-driving cars, but there aren't any cars out there that customers can drive without humans. I guess you have at least one or two safety drivers in them still. But eventually, the hope is that you will be able to harvest that, and there will be products that create value, and that's where the curve gets above the zero, and that's when you're harvesting those benefits. You blow that up to the entire economy, and what you can have is a period of below trend productivity growth, according to the official statistics, followed by above trend. And I'm actually pretty optimistic that we are just turning the corner on that. I just had an op-ed last month called The Coming Productivity Boom. I made a bet with my friend Bob Gordon on long bets that productivity is going to be significantly higher than what the Congressional Budget Office predicts or what others people are predicting. And that's in the paper, it argues why, but the gist of it, a big part of it is this productivity J curve that we've made a big investments in intangibles that we can now start harvesting.
So Google spends billions of dollars on research and publishes a lot of papers, open source libraries. We put stuff on Google Cloud. Does your model at all capture the intangibles that kind of come from that for other firms? Because, as a superstar firm that is able to do a lot of this work.
So this model doesn't even count for that. So this is only the part that Google captures. And to the extent that there are big spillovers like that, the numbers would, the productivity gains would be greater in the economy overall. And that'd be something to flesh out further. So this is just counting, what the stockholders get. So it's actually a narrow measure of it. Let me take a few minutes to talk about the transformation of work. So this is an old question that technology might destroy jobs, and people have been worried about it since the Luddites, almost exactly 200 years ago. And that's partly reflecting the idea that technology can substitute for human labor, and that will drive down the demand for human labor. And we see that in some places, like here's a paper I did on translation where that exactly happened. But there are actually a number of other things technology can do. In addition to substituting, it can also complement, like, when the Wright brothers invented a plane, it made the value of pilots go way up. In fact, there was really no value of pilots before that. And then jet engines made the value of pilots go up even more. So technologies can increase the value of labor as well as decreasing it. And through most of history, actually, mostly technology has been a complement. What we are willing to pay for an hour of wage labor went up mostly for the past 200 years because labor can do a lot more than it used to be able to. Although the past 20 years, it's actually been pretty flat or negative. So it's nothing inevitable that complements are going to be more important than substitutes. And there are these other factors that are described in the paper with Tom Mitchell there in Science that are also important. So it's not just substitution, even though that's the first one that comes to mind for most people and leads to this sort of Luddite idea. Substitution can be important, but it's not the only one. So to understand what parts of tasks would be affected by machine learning, we created a rubric. And you could, for instance, look at radiologists. And what we found is that some of the jobs done by radiologists, some of the tasks done by radiologists, like interpreting medical images, can be done much better by machines now. So that particular task is increasingly substituted. But there are many other things like administering conscious sedation or doing physical exams that most of us would not want a robot to be doing. If you look at the entire set of the 27 tasks that radiologists do, only a minority of them are significantly affected by machine learning. And that applies in every single occupation we looked at. We looked at 1,800 different occupations, or 900 occupations, I should say. And what we found was that there wasn't a single one where machine learning, ran the table and was able to do all of them. In each case, parts of the job were done by humans, still done better by humans, and other parts were increasingly able to be done by different kinds of machine learning technology. The total effect is potentially pretty large, even if it's not all jobs, $700 billion of potential effect. And it's uneven in terms of who's going to be affected by it. Sorry for going a little fast. I guess I can post the slides for you guys if you want. If you look at different occupations, some low-wage occupations towards the left here, like cashiers, have many tasks that are suitable for machine learning, so they score high. Some relatively high-wage jobs, like I mentioned, pilots, now are increasingly substitutable by machine learning. I couldn't help but peek at where economists were. So you get the general trend there is a bit of a downward slope, which means that on average, the low-wage jobs have more parts of them that are substitutable with current technologies by machine learning. You can zoom in on different parts of the country. We have data on worldwide or different geographies. I presented this at Congress, and the folks, Mike Enzi in Wyoming was very concerned that Wyoming has a lot of red areas, which means a lot of their tasks are actually suitable for machine learning. You can also do it by different companies. The scatter plot on the right there is where red dot is where Walmart is. They're above average in terms of the number of tasks in their company that could be replaced by machine learning. They're also a little bit to the right, which means they, as a company, they have more people who are good at AI and machine learning than most of the other retail companies. But you could look at any given company in the economy and basically get an estimate of how vulnerable it is and also how many capabilities they have to address those challenges. We have ways of zooming in on different roles within the companies. I'm going to skip through that. I'll just give you, the last couple of minutes, I'll just mention a big project that we're doing now is to analyze a few 100 million online job postings. And maybe there's folks at Google who can help us with this as well. And we've looked at the full text of them and used NLP to understand how jobs relate to each other. And we have a tool called Job2Vec that basically puts every job posting out there, comparing it to other jobs in a space. And you can then do analyses to see, for instance, how similar a data scientist is to a machine learning expert, or how similar a nurse's job in Miami is to a nurse's job in New York City, or how similar a nurse's job is in 2010 to a nurse's job in 2020. You can make different kinds of manipulations of the space and understand the relationships, and even extrapolate with some caution into the future if you assume that some of the past trends will continue at least for a little while. You can also get a sense of which jobs are more or less remotable with remote work using these techniques. And so let me just summarize by saying that these digital technologies are widely available, but one of the main takeaways from my long talk is that technology is not enough to boost productivity, that you also need to change your business processes and models and develop new skills. And that leads to this productivity J-curve where you're making big investments in intangibles. They're even bigger than the technology investments. But ultimately, when you harvest those intangibles, you get a productivity boom. And that's what happened in the past, and I see it in the cards for us with artificial intelligence. I went quickly through this last part, but there's also a number of tools to understand the kinds of skills that are needed in the workforce and how companies and individual workers can position themselves as parts of jobs are increasingly have the potential to be automated. Other parts of jobs and other tasks will become relatively more important, and understanding which is which puts you in a position, as just managing your own career, but also managing a corporation to be positioned for success, because you want to not just be looking at what skills are in demand today, but I think we can make some predictions about what kinds of skills will be in greater or less demand in the coming years. So lots of papers about this available at my websites. The last one there, Brynjolfsson.com, has all the papers I've written in one place, but you can look more broadly at the Digital Economy Lab or some of these other websites for more related work by other people as well. And with that, I think I'm officially out of time, but I am happy, as Greg suggested, to stay a little extra time if you have any questions or comments on any of what I've presented.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Erik. And first, Emmy, you have a question?
Oops. Yeah, Erik, thank you so much. Just really quickly, I'm curious, what does this mean in terms of the value proposition of traditionally marginalized groups in successful organizations? For example, there are a lot of points of expertise that sort of were considered not as valuable, talk of soft skills, things like that. Yeah. I'm just curious what this means for traditionally marginalized groups and not leaving economic value on the table anymore across those lines. I was just wondering if you could speak to maybe some countervailing thinking there.
So when we went through the kinds of tasks that are more suitable for machine learning and other types of technologies, there are two big categories that humans still have a big advantage in. One, we've heard a lot about in the press for a long time, it's creative work, scientific work, entrepreneurial work, even artistic creative work. But another big category that's even actually much bigger is emotional intelligence, human interactions, caring for people, whether it's children or older people, healthcare, as well as coaching, persuading, those kinds of tasks. There are, I think, millions of jobs, millions of people in those categories that won't readily be replaced and shouldn't be replaced by machines. And if anything, their demand may go up. I see Hal Varian's on the talk here. He has a nice paper called Bots and Tots, talking about how the demographics and the aging of the workforce mean we're going to need more people in many of those kinds of categories. So the demand will go up. There are also tasks that a lot of people can do, so the supply could grow just as rapidly. And then we have to make I think a societal judgment about how much we want to value those. If we certainly have the potential as the productivity grows to have more total income. And one thing I want to stress is that although income inequality has grown recently, that there's nothing inevitable about that continuing. We could make decisions as a society to pay caregivers more and have more income go in those directions, even if they've historically been marginalized, as you point out. Those are as much policy choices and value judgments as they are determined by any technology.
Any other questions?
Building on that, is upward mobility hindered, right? If the marginal dollar is always going to be the investment on the marginal dollar here is always going to look better for Google, Microsoft, and some of these top firms versus sort of new entrants or certain incumbents.
Yeah, I think that's a real challenge, and we have seen evidence, to my surprise, that the economy has become significantly less dynamic. There's less mobility. John Halterwanger and Steve Davis and others have shown that there are fewer startups being created. There's less movement from one company to another, less movement geographically. So less economic dynamism and mobility over the past 20 or 30 years. And that's a serious concern, not just from an equity point of view, but also I think it hampers economic growth and productivity when the country and the economy doesn't reconfigure itself as rapidly. Again, I don't think there's an inevitable force that requires us to have more concentration of wealth and power and less mobility. We can make choices that make it easier for people to move and to gain skills, so we can make investments in education and training. I just wrote a paper about how occupational licensing is making it difficult for people to move from one area to another. Occupational licensing has grown a lot, and we could have less of that. And then there are a number of things we can do in antitrust and elsewhere to make sure that there's competition, and that startups and new companies are able to challenge incumbents like Google, and are able to introduce new products and services. So those are all things that people are looking at, and I want to stress that there are some policy choices we could make that keep us from having greater concentration of wealth and power. But it's a big concern. I think that there are some technological forces that make it easier to have more concentration, and we have to lean against that if we don't want it to happen.
Devansh?
Yeah, thanks for this talk. I wanted to ask, what is, in your opinion, some examples of the biggest firms or products that have like a large delta between the total factor productivity that's measured and what they're actually providing? And I'm kind of curious for not just your academic, but also then your intuition, like some examples that I might think of is.
The biggest gap is the one that I pointed to that really motivated this whole creation of GDPB, which is between digital goods and services and those that are paid for. So companies like Google and nonprofits like Wikipedia that create huge amounts of free goods and services are likely creating far more consumer surplus than what shows up in the productivity numbers. And so we're working to try to document that. We have a project with Facebook right now to document some of the value that it creates. And that's a part of the economy that I'm sure is growing, even if the official statistics don't show that, but I'm sure it's growing. And if you look at, say, time spent, it's growing. And according to we've only done a few of these studies now, but according to what people are willing to pay or have to be paid to stop using them, there's more and more value there. But there are other parts, there are in pharmaceuticals and vaccines and biotech. I think there's huge amounts of value there. I mean, people are willing to pay a lot for one extra life year, one extra healthy life year, as they should be. And the numbers from Better Health are just staggering. There was one study some years ago that the value of increased life expectancy over the past 50 years is worth as much as the value of all other technological innovation in the economy put together. They're roughly equal. And that sounds about right. I mean, I have about as many flat screen TVs in my house as I want. I don't know that I get a lot of value from having another one, but if you could give me another year or even month of life, that would be worth a lot. So those are a couple of categories. Then there are some that, we're thinking of trying to measure better in terms of environment and social side of things. They're kind of squishy, but it might be worth getting some rough numbers in those as well.
And Nick?
Yeah, thank you so much for making the time to chat with us. And I enjoyed The Second Machine Age when I read it when it came out. So randomly, I had dinner with my dad last night. We were just unrelatedly talking about a lot of these topics because he just turned 70, I just turned 34, and we were talking about decades. And I think what I've seen in the 8 years since The Second Machine Age came out, or even longer than that, is that the last, 10 years have actually been fairly disappointing from the perspective of expectations versus what's happened.
Yes.
And I think the two things that come to mind for me, I'm maybe more in, I don't dispute camps 2 and 4 as you've articulated, but I maybe think we might be undervaluing 1 and 3. So I think what has turned out was that the quality of AI or machine learning needed to deliver on self-driving cars ended up being far, far, far harder and higher to actually make it practical. And I think the other thing is, of course, people had high in the sky expectations. So I guess my question for you is, how do you think about these threshold effects? Because I agree with you that some of these things will permit productivity booms once some threshold is crossed, but like, I guess I'm a little bit skeptical that there are linear improvements to be had. I think it's like nothing, 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 and then maybe all at once. And I'm just curious about your reaction to that.
No,
which is also why I was skeptical of the regression thing before. Yeah,
I was also disappointed in the past decade. And if Bob Gordon had taken me up on a bet, 10 years ago or 8 years ago, he would have won for the past years. I would have expected productivity. And as you know, in the second machine age, I think it was Hal and some of my clients at Google, they got me to drive around a self-driving car in 2013, and I think it was 2012 actually. And I was just amazed. We were driving down Route 101, and it seemed like we were pretty darn close. But I guess that last 5 or 10% is a lot more work than I had figured, and I guess even the experts who were telling me had figured. At the same time, I want to be fair. What happened with, say, with drug discovery and protein folding, and being able to develop vaccines so much more quickly is way beyond what I think a lot of us expected. And so that there's some good news in those areas as well. It's tricky to make predictions about which parts of the future technologies are going to happen faster or slower. So I temper some of the pessimism about what happened with optimism on other dimensions. And maybe it's just my nature, but when I look at the set of things in the pipeline and the productivity J-curve, I remain kind of optimistic going forward. I put my money where my mouth is on that one. But I know the Congressional Budget Office doesn't agree with me. So there's some pretty smart people who remain more pessimistic than they used to be.
So let me ask one, maybe like maybe a direction for following up on the interaction. It seems like a lot of your work is pointing towards a better forecast, right? Better forecasting of which job categories, social groups, regions are going to be more or less affected, and also what policymakers or business leaders can do to push results into one direction or another one. So what do you think is a good direction for modeling this process, the dynamics of this process? And what data would you need? What compute would you need? Like ML, you're already starting to use ML.
Yeah, well, one great thing is we've got lots more data than we used to have. So much more fine-grained data. And I'm on the statistics committee of the American Economic Association, and we've got great support from Amazon and from other companies. Hal, of course, has been a huge help. And so I think we're sort of at a turning point from going from the traditional surveys that the government sent out to using a lot more real-time data. As you can imagine, it has some strengths and weaknesses. It's much more fine-grained, like orders of magnitude, more detailed, more real-time, but it's not as representative. There's people who are on LinkedIn that, and other people, a lot of janitors aren't on LinkedIn or truck drivers, and more software engineers. So you have to account for all of those kinds of discrepancies. But ultimately, I think we're in a position to start getting much better data about those things. At the same time, I mean, paradoxically, there's many ways we have worse measures. I mentioned earlier that I don't think we have as good measures of IT use by companies as we used to because of cloud and other things. You guys might be able to help us with that. I'm going to plea again for that. And so there are things we're going to be doing better and things that we're doing worse on these different dimensions. But the other big change is just in terms of mindset. I used to be relatively alone working on how the economics of IT and digitization. Now there's a huge group. Hal and I, along with Susan Athey and Catherine Tucker, run a group at the NBER. We just had a meeting last week with over 100 economists who are working on these questions from lots of different schools. And really smart economists are now turning their brain power towards these questions. So that I'm thinking that will also help.
Yeah, Hal?
Yeah, I wanted to put a word in about autonomous vehicles. It's important to recognize that the problem with autonomous vehicles is not the vehicles, it's people. If you took all the cars and all the people out of San Francisco, an autonomous vehicle would work just great. It's figuring out what those crazy humans are going to do, where the real problems are.
Psychology and game theory. I'm told there's a new city being built in China where the lower level is going to be 100% limited to autonomous vehicles, and then that simplifies the problem quite a bit.
And even doing something like shutting down a lane on Interstate 5 and saying autonomous trucks only, that would be a huge boost to productivity.
And this is how most technologies have progressed, is that, you know, even just regular cars, I mean, they wouldn't work very well. I'm looking out in these fields in my backyard here. If it weren't for roads, you know, traditional cars wouldn't be terribly useful. So historically, we've done a lot of work to change the environment. And my friend, my former student, Matt Bean, has been writing a lot about how, you know, introducing robots in different situations, that sometimes a little bit of modification of the environment can go, it makes it a lot easier than trying to have the robot go that last few percent.
And one, like, in the direction of like trying to capture the future, a lot of the models that seem to be being made right now, like you were using, are fairly linear things where you're trying to estimate the treatment effects, that kind of stuff. But it seems like it can make actual decisions, as opposed to just saying positive coefficient or negative coefficient, something, you know, simple like that. You need to have like nonlinear forecasting kind of thing. And it doesn't seem like that's the norm among economists right now. Susan Ithey's probably the exception. So where do you see that going?
Yeah, you're right. It's not so much part of the norm. Economists have traditionally focused much more on trying to understand the causal nature of what's going on, and simpler models where you can understand what each of the components. So as soon as you get a model with dozens, let alone, you know, thousands or hundreds of thousands of variables, economists start becoming uncomfortable and worry about overfitting. I had a kind of an aha moment, I don't know, like eight years ago, when I really realized the difference between prediction questions and control or causal questions. And economists are now beginning to appreciate a lot more that for prediction questions, it may be okay to not understand all the causal characteristics as well if the prediction works well. But there's an ongoing tension there. But you're right, more economists are moving that direction, and people like Susan bridge those worlds really, really nicely.
So let me actually push on that, because this is something that's related to some of our projects here, and let me know if you are running out of time. Causal, you can have, what will be the value of a neural net model? You have no idea what it's saying internally, but you've done double machine learning, you've done matching to separate, you know, treatments and control, you've done all the causal stuff, so it's causally valid. You can't tell you, if you push this button, this will happen, but you cannot look at it internally.
Well, that's related. So there's distinct questions there. I think I'm kind of more on the end of the spectrum, that I see value in those kinds of models. But when I talk to my MBA students, and I talk to doctors, and I talk to a lot of economists, they feel very uncomfortable with those kinds of models, because they do want to understand what's going on. I think in the back of the mind that you know, when errors are made, I think we still have pretty different standards for an error made by a machine versus a human. And back to our self-driving car example, I don't think we would tolerate 30,000 deaths from self-driving cars. We probably wouldn't tolerate 3,000 or even 300 deaths from self-driving cars a year. So we have a higher standard of understanding what's going on inside of them before we unleash them on us.
No, that's fair. And most of the technologies that would come out of this place would be more of the less understanding, better forecasting accuracy, but you don't know why.
Yeah, but I, you know, again, I'm a little bit, I'm more of the camp that I see the value of those models. And one of the things I stress when I'm on a panel discussing this or whatever is that you think humans know why they're making decisions? I mean, you know, read Kahneman and Tversky. There's so much confabulation that goes on where people make up stories ex post. There's a lot of neurons up in our brains that are coming to decisions for reasons that we have no real clue. And we fool ourselves and we fool others when we tell people a reason for why we made a decision.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's something where we're trying to understand when insight matters, but it seems like when you ask like 5 economists, you get 10 opinions, and they come from these coefficients, which are, it's unclear what they're showing, because you have a, a linear derivative on top of the current point in space-time, and, dynamic space of the economy. And you have no idea if right over the linear derivative, there's going to be a shift. Because your approximation is linear, not No,
that's the danger. Is that if you don't understand the model, then you're going to be more likely to miss these turning points and not understand what range of values it works for and what range it doesn't work for. But again, that's true for humans as well. And so what I try to stress is not is this model perfect? It is always correct, but is it better? Is it useful compared to a human? And that applies not just in terms of accuracy, but also in terms of bias and some of the other dimensions that people attack machine learning systems based on. And I think the benchmark has to be what's the best alternative, which is often a deeply flawed human system.
Right. So yeah, I think following up, maybe you might. It would be great to interact with you about, like, we've been talking to MC to get their data on, like, for example, matrices connecting industries to jobs, and you have owner job codes, and you already identify which ones are automatable. Actually, try to understand which localities are going to be impacted by automation of these skills, because then you can just propagate it back and actually make a forecast. And that you can say that people move from other data sets. People move towards these kinds of jobs at these rates. So you can actually talk about migration as a result of automation.
I would love to. So I've unfortunately flashed through those slides pretty quickly, but you saw that we've got geography. We're working with Zillow. We're working with Burning Glass Technologies, working with LinkedIn. And we'd love to work more with Google to understand all these different metrics. But you can imagine it affects wages, housing prices, job prospects, technology, broadband. Google has been doing some experiments with Google Fiber. And all of those things would be great to put into the mix and understand how some of these variables predict the other ones.
Awesome. Well, I'll just reach out afterwards.
That'd be great, Greg. Thanks.
Any other questions? I think we're way over time, but.
This was awesome. Thank you so much.
Yes.
My pleasure. Good talking to you all.
Yeah, thank you very much. And
thanks for inviting me.
Please send me your slides when you get a chance so I can forward them.
Absolutely. Great.
Thanks.